The town of Millhaven, Ohio, had a way of going quiet in the late afternoon, the kind of quiet that settles slowly like dust after a long day, the kind you only notice when you stop moving long enough to breathe it in. Ray Calloway noticed it every evening around 5 o'clock, when the last customer of the day drove off and he was left alone with the hum of the fluorescent lights inside his garage. He would wipe his hands on a red shop rag, pour himself a cup of coffee from the old percolator on the shelf, and stand in the open bay door watching the light go gold over the grain elevator across the highway. Ray had owned Calloway's Auto Repair for going on 22 years. The sign above the door was faded at the edges, and the concrete floor was stained with the memory of 1,000 oil changes. The waiting area held 3 plastic chairs, a stack of old magazines nobody ever read, and a coffee maker that Ray had bought second-hand in 2007 and refused to replace on the grounds that it still worked fine. But the tools were clean, the work was honest, and people in Millhaven trusted Ray the way they trusted the weather reports on AM radio. Not always perfectly, but enough. He was a broad-shouldered man with grey creeping into his dark hair and a quietness about him that some people mistook for coldness. It wasn't coldness. It was just the particular stillness of a man who had learned that most things didn't need to be said out loud. His wife Carol had told him once that he communicated better with cars than with people. He hadn't argued the point. There was something straightforward about engines. They either worked or they didn't. They told you the truth if you knew how to listen. It was a Tuesday in October when the blue Buick rolled in with a grinding sound coming from the front left wheel. The car moved slowly, almost apologetically, easing into the lot like it was embarrassed about the noise it was making. Ray set down his coffee and walked out to meet it. The woman who stepped out was somewhere in her late 60s, with white hair pulled back neatly and eyes that were red around the edges, the kind of red that doesn't come from allergies. She was dressed in dark clothes, and there was a tissue folded in her left hand, even though she wasn't crying right now. She had the look of someone who had been crying earlier and was trying very hard to be done with it. "I'm sorry to just pull in like this," she said. "I wasn't sure where else to go. I heard a terrible sound starting about 3 miles back, and I was afraid to drive it any further." He looked at the wheel, then back at her. "How long has it been making that noise?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't know. My husband usually handled all of this." She paused. "He passed 6 weeks ago." Ray nodded. He didn't say he was sorry, not because he wasn't, but because he'd found over the years that the words landed hollow when strangers said them. Instead, he just said, "Let me take a look." Her name was Dorothy Arrives. She sat on the wooden bench just inside the bay while Ray put the car up on the lift. The bearing on the front left was nearly gone, worn down to nothing, metal grinding on metal. Another 10 miles and she'd have lost the wheel entirely. He came around and showed her what he'd found, explaining it simply without talking down to her. He pointed to the worn bearing, described what it did and what happened when it failed, and told her she had been lucky to stop when she did. "How much will it cost?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment. He looked at the tissue in her hand. He looked at the way she sat, straight-backed and careful, like a woman holding herself together through sheer determination. "Nothing," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. The part's about $40. I've got one on the shelf. Labor won't take me more than an hour. Consider it done." "I can't let you do that," she said. "That isn't right." "Ma'am," Ray said, "my father taught me there are times when a thing is right and times when a thing is business. This here is one of the first kind." Dorothy Arrives looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and looked down at her hands. "My husband would have liked you," she said softly. Ray went back to work. He changed the bearing while the October sun finished its descent. When the car was done, he drove it around the block, listened to the silence where the grinding used to be, and pulled back in satisfied. Dorothy thanked him 3 times. On her way out, she pressed a $20 bill into his hand, and he let her, understanding it wasn't about the money. It was about her needing to give something back, needing the exchange to feel balanced, even when it couldn't be. He put the bill in the coffee can he kept for the volunteer fire department, the same can his father had kept on the same shelf for the same reason, 30 years before him. The next morning, Ray opened the shop. At 7:30, the same as always. He had 2 appointments on the books, and a brake job he was hoping to finish by noon. At 9:45, 3 black SUVs turned into his lot. They weren't the kind of vehicles that came in for oil changes. 4 men, says 4 men, tapped out wearing dark jackets with letters on the back, federal agents. Ray watched them come across the lot toward him with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had nothing to hide and had learned long ago that panic never helped a situation. The lead agent was a younger man named Webb, with a serious face and a clipboard. He introduced himself, showed credentials, and explained that they were investigating a series of fraudulent vehicle registrations connected to a network operating out of the county. Several vehicles had passed through local repair shops with altered VIN plates, and they were canvassing every mechanic in a 30-mile radius. Ray invited them inside. He opened his records without being asked. He answered every question calmly and completely. They were there for about 40 minutes. Near the end, Agent Webb looked up from his clipboard and said, "Mr. Calloway, do you know a woman named Dorothy Haynes?" Ray said he did. He explained that she'd come in the day before with a bad wheel bearing and he'd fixed it for her. Webb nodded slowly. He exchanged a look with one of the other agents, then looked back at Ray. "Mrs. Haynes," Webb said carefully, "is the mother-in-law of the man we've been looking for. We've had her under passive surveillance for the past 2 weeks, thinking he might make contact. When she drove into your shop yesterday, it flagged our system." Ray was quiet for a moment. "She didn't know anything about that," he said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Webb said, "she doesn't. She's not a suspect. She's just connected by circumstance." He paused. "She told our field contact this morning that a mechanic in town fixed her car for free yesterday. Said it was the first kind thing a stranger had done for her since her husband died." Webb cleared his throat. "That contact passed it up the chain. It's part of why we wanted to come talk to you directly, rather than send a formal notice." Ray nodded slowly, processing all of it. "You're free and clear," Webb said. "Your records are clean. We appreciate your cooperation." The agents packed up their clipboards and walked back to their vehicles. Ray stood in the bay door and watched them pull out of the lot, one by one, until the highway was empty again, and the only sound was the wind moving through the old oak tree at the corner of the property. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood there for a while. He thought about Dorothy Haynes driving 3 miles on a ruined bearing, alone in the car, 6 weeks without her husband. He thought about the tissue in her hand and the way she'd said he would have liked you, in a voice that was steady but full. He thought about all the miles she must have driven in that car, with her husband sitting in the passenger seat, and how different it must feel now to drive it alone. He thought about how a single act, a small and ordinary decision, made without any thought of reward, had sent ripples outward in directions he couldn't have imagined. How it had drawn the attention of federal agents, triggered surveillance systems, brought black SUVs to his quiet lot in Millhaven, Ohio. how the whole machinery of law enforcement had turned its eye briefly in his direction because he had replaced a wheel bearing without charging for it. And how, at the end of all of it, the only thing that truly mattered was that an old woman had driven home safely the night before, that she had arrived wherever she was going without the wheel giving out on a dark county road, that she had walked into her house, the house that must have felt too large and too quiet since her husband passed, and she had gotten there in one piece. He finished his coffee. He rinsed the cup in the utility sink, set it upside down on the shelf to dry, and picked up his wrench. He went back to work. Outside, the October sky was wide and blue, and the town of Millhaven went on being quiet in the way it always did. Slowly, gently, like it had all the time in the world.